Hello everyone, Mr. Ristau. Today we have some notes from Chapter 11. Chapter 11 covers religion and reform from 1800 to 1860. And you might be asking yourself, what is reform? Well, the word reform at its very core means to change. And in our context here in American history, we're going to be looking at the time period that where reforms were made or there were changes that were made in something, typically social, society or politics, political reform, or an economic institution or practice that was changed in some way in order to improve it and to make it better. A reform movement, which this time period you're going to read about many, is a type of, in general, a social movement that whose goal is to bring about a social or political system closer to what the community is envisioning. So that's what's going to be happening during this time. And this particular chapter, though we see reform movements and religion start to intersect and blend together. And one of the questions here that I have here on the screen, of course, you want to ask yourself is, in what ways do the social movements and religion begin to intersect? And religion would actually play a key role in many of the social movements of the time period, whether they were abolition, the banning or getting rid of slavery, temperance, which was the banning of alcohol and whatnot. So religion is going to play a key role in many of these social movements, specifically in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. So here's a quick preview of what we're going to be looking at. You can see here, I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can see here all of these things generally are happening at the same time and over a period of time. Remember from the first slide, you saw the time period 1800 to 1860. So we're not just going to be limited to just 1 decade or 2 decades. These are all things that are happening roughly at the same time, all before the Civil War. Like I said, it covers a 60-year time period. There's lots of overlap between them. There are a lot of things that they have in common. There's a lot of common sentiments between them. But there's also still divisions, especially when it comes to the role of women. So we'll be looking at not just specific women like Dorothea Dix or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony, but we'll also be taking a look at the abolitionist movement, for example, their views of women and the women's rights movement, which has its roots, its origins during this time period. Okay? Different groups, different organizations will have their different opinions and divisions when it comes to women. Now, many of these social movements began and have their roots in, they've originated from, or I should say maybe they're inspired by the Second Great Awakening. If you recall, the Second Great Awakening, remember, took place because of this lack of religious zeal that started to fade away by the turn of the century, by 1790 and 1800. Recall the First Great Awakening took place around 1730 and into 1740. But by 1820 and 30, there was a wave of religious revival that started to spread across the country. Remember, there were these camp meetings like you see here in the photograph up here, that started to take place throughout the countryside, throughout the frontier. And the man responsible for a lot of these, or at least the most notable, was Charles Grandison Finney. He was the revival preacher that preached in upstate New York in the 1830s and talked about the evils of alcohol and the evils of slavery. And remember, a lot of these evangelical Protestants, the belief was, the message was that it was good and right to improve oneself, to look at the inner self. And there were a number of people that were converted and were born again Christians. And during the Second Great Awakening, there was a huge increase in the attendance of church, much more so than the First Great Awakening. And there were more religious sects and denominations that started to take shape, especially Methodists, Baptists. And like I said, they really stressed a personal conversion. as opposed to predestination. Predestination is so 1730 now, or so colonial era, right, from the late 1600s. That's kind of gone by the wayside to a large extent. And one of the other things that sets apart the Second Great Awakening from the first is that I have mentioned this earlier in the previous lecture, that it's much more democratic in terms of church affairs, how the church is organized, how the church is controlled, and this is going to seep into society and politics and economics. If you recall, we talked a little bit about that with the market revolution, how jobs and politics and how the country at this time is becoming more democratized during the age of Jackson, right? This again, remember, is the age of Jackson. And there's more emotion when it comes to people worshiping and going to church based on feeling, much more so than it was during the First Great Awakening. Now, the religious revival here that was the Second Great Awakening is going to inspire many of these reform movements that you're going to read about in chapter 11. Right? There was an increase in evangelicalism, and that's going to inspire this era, this kind of mini era known as the Age of Reform, where social reformers would try to change and make and improve on prison reform, prisons, the treatment of prisoners, temperance, pointing out the evils of alcohol and heavy drinking. The women's rights movement, like I said, has its origins here in the Reform era, or during the 1830s and 40s, and also the abolitionist or the anti-slavery movement. And a key part of the Second Great Awakening was the key role that women would play in religion. So the Second Great Awakening would inspire, for example, the women's rights movement, among other movements, but it also kind of worked the other way. Women would play a key role in membership in the church. The majority of new church members were women, and women would bring about the family, right? One of the roles of women in the family, if you recall, the term Republican motherhood and the raising of children. Well, part of those duties was bringing the family back to God. And it also inspired the involvement in other various reform efforts as well. So I only use this as an introduction. The Second Great Awakening, you're not going to find it necessarily at the beginning of chapter 11, but I put these two slides here just to serve as a reminder that many of these reform movements have their origins and inspirations in the Second Great Awakening. So let's talk about those transcendentalists. Transcendentalism, kind of spearheaded by two of the biggies of American literature, certainly in the 1800s, if not ever, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, practiced and preached and wrote about transcendentalism, which basically means that every person, they believed, possesses some sort of inner light that can illuminate the highest truth and put them in direct touch with God. And when I was in high school, they just a little side note here, we read Emerson and Thoreau, and I didn't necessarily find them all that interesting. And I can't speak for a lot of people, but I didn't find them all that interesting, personally. But of course, after, maturing and growing up, and I can now appreciate what they were talking about, I still find them challenging to read, especially Ralph Waldo Emerson. And there was a heavy emphasis placed on the inner self that these men were writing about. I mean, these guys were obviously people who have made significant contributions to literature. They've made significant contributions to philosophy. There is Ralph Waldo Emerson there. And they've made quite a few contributions to both civic and political discourse. So, for example, Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, basically wrote and practiced civil disobedience when he refused to pay taxes. That would eventually fund the Mexican-American War. And he did go and serve time in jail, although the time that he served was very brief. But Thoreau was one of those guys that really walked the walk. And Many of his writings on civil disobedience inspired others like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and many other leaders. So that's really, nothing to shake a stick at. So my personal feelings from whatever it's been now, 35 some years ago in high school, have changed somewhat, and I can definitely appreciate what these men have written about and what their message was to inspire the likes of the titans of civil rights and whatnot and human rights, with Martin Luther King Jr., of course, and Gandhi, not to mention, many others. Here is Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is primarily known, like I said, for writing Walden. He lived in nature for 2 years, letting the squirrels run all over his face and whatnot. And that's when he wrote a lot of his civil disobedience or his political and civic writings as well, to resist unjust laws that were passed by government. A woman that was actually influenced largely too, a transcendentalist, was Margaret Fuller. She wrote about women's social independence. And then you had another titan of American literature, Walt Whitman, who wrote the book Leaves of Grass. So if you remember anything about the transcendentalists, remember that the emphasis was on the individual, how to better the individual, right? So this goes in line with what we know about the Second Great Awakening, where the emphasis, big shocker, was on the individual, right? And how to better the individual in order to better society. And that was some of the main focus, the main message that the transcendentalists were writing about. Now, what I'd like you to do, you notice here I have a video embedded. I have a number of videos embedded into the Google slide here. So I have this link. It's in the folder. It's in the folder found on Schoology, and it's in I believe, the chapters 11 and 12 folder. So you can stop it here, and I will still be here when you get back, but I would like you to watch the short clip here about Henry David Thoreau. It's just a few minutes long. It's probably a little more in-depth than what it needs to be, but it does a great job of explaining the overview of Henry David Thoreau and his philosophy of civil disobedience. So please watch it, and it'll do you a lot of good, and I will be here when you get back. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you found the Thoreau video interesting. He was an interesting character, both he and Emerson. So welcome back, and here come the communes. Now, the communes were based on a concept, based on a concept or this idea of utopia. And a utopia, we've talked briefly about what utopias are. If you recall, they're kind of an imagined place or a state of being, a state of things, which everything is perfect. And these were societies, specifically a couple here that we'll talk about, the Oneidas and the Shakers, societies that try to achieve perfection. And the first society that's mentioned in your textbook were the Shakers. We've talked about the Shakers a couple of different times. They were founded by a woman named Mother Ann Lee. And the Shakers, we already know a little bit about the Shakers, and what they did is what separated them from other groups of the time period is they promoted women as equals in their churches. Men and women were equals. There was no difference between the gender roles. And they also advocated celibacy, and therefore the group never grew out of procreation between men and women. You had to join the group. So they had a very celibate lifestyle. So they had basically a problem with longevity. And you can read about the Shakers, and you can read about the Shakers on your own. They were very interesting, and their meetings they usually ended up with the group in this kind of circular fashion that you see in the photograph, where they would dance around be wild and crazy, and it was said that would make the whole room and the ceiling shake. So that's where the name Shakers comes from. The other group, the other utopia group, was the Oneida Colony. Now, these people were completely different altogether. The Oneida community, largely located in New York, were members that were expected to work, each according to his or her own abilities. Women tended to do many of the domestic duties. Men really, if they didn't have a specific trained skill, they performed unskilled jobs. They worked in and around the house, the fields, various industries. Now, what the Oneida community did is they practiced free love, and they sought to achieve perfection through free love. And they practiced this also concept known as complex marriage. So the Oneida community believes strongly in the system of this complex marriage, where any member was free to have sex with any other member who consented. And I'm not going to go into any great detail here. You can also read about the Oneidas, the Oneida community. But the Oneida community did not seek a consequence-free sex for pleasure, but they believed that because of the natural outcome of intercourse was pregnancy, they believed that raising children was actually a community responsibility. So they had this unique way of pairing couples together that would try maybe to prevent pregnancy. But if in the event that pregnancy did happen, they strongly believed, it was widely believed and encouraged in the Oneida community, that the raising of children, childbearing, was the community's responsibility, not necessarily just the couples. So, in addition to all of that, women in the community also became a religious role model for many of the younger men in the community, and they also practiced a concept known as mutual criticism. And I hate to laugh about this, but mutual criticism was basically the Oneida's version of public humiliation. And that's what it was. Every member of the community was subject to criticism by a committee of the community as a whole during a general meeting. So they would pick people out. People would they would basically be the center of attention, and then this committee would shame them. And the goal was to eliminate any undesirable character traits that this person might have. So imagine, being picked out of the community and being put on display only to be publicly humiliated and shamed by this committee. And the purpose was to get rid of any undesirable traits you might possess. So that's what the mutual criticism concept was based on. That was the Oneidas. Something a little more 21st century, and it's been around for a long time. The Oneida community is also known for their production of silverware. That's right, you heard me right, silverware, knives, forks, and spoons, and also their furniture. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of that and more about that in a minute. Another major movement that took place, at least as far as religion goes, was the Mormons and Joseph Smith. And I'm not going to go through all the details because you can read about Joseph Smith and the Mormons in your textbook. The Mormons are also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and of course they're still around today. And the Mormons, unlike the Oneidas and the Shakers, had a very strong hierarchical leadership, and they still do. Joseph Smith and his brother set off for the West. They left from the East Coast, and they were both murdered early on. And then the movement was picked up by a man named Brigham Young, and he brought the group all the way out to present-day Utah. It's one of the reasons why Utah is largely Mormon. And this was right around the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. And this was perfect timing for the Mormons to be arriving in Utah, because by that time, pre-Civil War and right after the war, we have a lot of people heading out west. And they flourished out in Utah, in and around the Great Salt Lake and Salt Lake City in Utah. Now, I'm going to have, going back to there is Brigham Young right there in the upper right-hand corner. He's the man that led the Mormons out to Utah upon the death of Joseph Smith. Going back to the Oneidas, I told you earlier that the Oneidas were largely responsible for many things, but here you go. The Oneidas today, you can find Oneida silverware in Target at a very cheap, low price at your local Target. And if you look around your house, you may have some of this Oneida furniture or this Oneida silverware in your silverware drawer at home. So you can see what I did here. I just went right onto the Target app, and there it is. All right. So this is one of the long-lasting legacies of the Oneida community. The other one is furniture, like you're looking at here, this chair right here. The furniture that was made by the Oneida community was made with a purpose, and the way you can tell that it's was made by the Oneidas is that it was very thoughtfully made. It doesn't have a lot of fancy schmancy drawers or fancy schmancy engravings. You know, it's very ornate. It's very functional, and it's very well proportioned, like this chair is. So there isn't a lot of ornamentation on it, right? A lot of carvings or anything like that. If you look around your house, you may ask mom or dad if you have any furniture that it was made or has the brand name or the mark on it that is made by the Oneida community. And you very well could. And it may look something like this. It's not going to be very, like I said, very full of engravings or carvings or things like that. It's going to be very ornate and very well proportioned, much like this chair. Now, what I'm going to do here is we're going to move on to we need to talk a little bit about what was going on with the urban pop culture and throughout the United States, or at least part of the United States. What we looked at earlier there with the Oneida communities and some of those other communes was really what was taking place in rural parts of the United States. But what was taking place in the urban settings is something called minstrel shows. And it was a form of urban pop culture where white actors used blackface. They would either put on, oil, or they would put on, shoe polish or something like that to paint their face black. These were white actors largely, and it promoted racism and stereotypes of African Americans and slaves, free blacks and or slaves. And these were minstrel shows that people attended. A lot of music was used, and a lot of plays were put on with characters. The most notable character was a character named Jim Crow. And we're going to be talking about the Jim Crow laws that would come into being after the Civil War in much of the South. But that's where the term Jim Crow comes from. And what I want you to do here when we're done with this slide is the very next slide that I have. I have a clip. I have a clip for you to watch, and I really, really, really encourage you to watch it, about minstrel shows. It comes from Ken Burns's big long documentary called Jazz. It's about 3 minutes, and I think you're really going to be shocked and really, quite surprised at how much racism was really promoted through these minstrel shows. So before we get to that video, there were also other movements that were taking place that centered in and around the urban centers of the United States, if I can use that term, urban centers, that largely showed a disdain for immigrants. And surprisingly, if you were to search YouTube, going back to the minstrel show theme, if you were to search YouTube for videos of minstrel shows, you would notice that many of them come from a much later time period, like the 1940s, the 1950s. That should tell you something, that this form of entertainment was popular in America for about 100 years. Blech. Okay? From about 1830, 40, all the way up to about 1940, 50. So it was around a long, long time. Okay, guys? That's why I encourage you to watch the video clip on the next slide. As far as nativist movements goes, remember nativist does not refer to native born. It refers to native born Americans. They're not actually native like Native Americans. Okay. Unfortunately, we would never give American Indians or Native Americans that much credit during this time. Remember, this was the Jackson era, and we're dealing with the Trail of Tears. So the nativist movements during this time largely disdained immigrants, and they called for an end to immigration. And they targeted the Irish, they targeted Germans. Irish and Germans were mostly Catholic, and they tended to vote Democrat. Eventually, these nativist movements would also come to target other different kinds of ethnic groups. Okay? That character there is Jim Crow. He was the main character in many of the minstrel shows. All right, so here's the video that I have set up, and what I'd like you to do is stop me now, go to the Google slide presentation, go to this presentation in Schoology, watch this short clip. Like I said, I think you're going to be quite shocked at the blatant racism that is being portrayed at these minstrel shows and how they originated back in the 1830s, and I'll be here when you get back. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you got a little bit of something out of the minstrel show video clip, and we need to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the major reform movements that took place during this time, and that was the abolition movement. And the abolition movement, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about why not every Northerner was pro-abolition, believe it or not. Some were against the idea of abolition. And when we talk about abolition, we're going to speak to a couple of people here, pre-Civil War, one in particular named David Walker, and another Nat Turner. And then, of course, another one, a big one later on down here on the slide you'll see is William Lloyd Garrison. Now, David Walker was an African American. He wrote, his claim to fame is he wrote a document, a paper known as an Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And what he did in that document is he basically framed and talked about all the different abuses of slavery, both immoral, how it was immoral, the evils of slavery during this time period of the Second Great Awakening, and how it didn't jive with religion and a person being a Christian, for example. And what he talked about in this paper the role of the individual to act responsibly for racial equality within the context of religion and politics. So it was an individual's duty, moral duty, to speak up and try and end the evils of slavery. And what separated David Walker perhaps from other abolitionists is that he advocated violence, actually, to end slavery. Many abolitionists thought his views were way too extreme, way over the top. And the purpose of the document, of an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, was to encourage readers to take an active role in fighting oppression, regardless of how much of a risk there actually was, and to actually press white Americans to realize the moral and religious failure that slavery was and the impact it was having on the country. Now, I shouldn't say the response, but right around the same time, in fact, it was the same year that David Walker's paper came out, Nat Turner's rebellion took place. And we've talked about a few rebellions before, but Nat Turner's rebellion was a doozy of a rebellion. Nat Turner, a slave, claimed to have revelations from Jesus Christ to lead the rebellion in Virginia that eventually killed 55 white people. 60 blacks, 60 slaves, including Turner, were eventually killed in retaliation. And I've mentioned this before. I'll say it again, as with all slave rebellions, slave laws did not become more lenient, but slave laws actually became more harsh as a result of the rebellion, and then the same holds true here with Nat Turner's rebellion. William Lloyd Garrison was known as more of an evangelical abolitionist. Notice that I have stars by his name, so his is a name that you're going to want to remember for sure. With William Lloyd Garrison, he wrote a paper known as The Liberator. And he published this paper from 1831 all the way up until 1865, the end of the Civil War. And for his time, he was known as a very radical abolitionist. Maybe not quite as far on the spectrum as David Walker was, but he was for his time a very radical abolitionist. And he would make his points known in The Liberator. And the very theme of The Liberator, he called for the immediate and uncompensated end to slavery. So in other words, current slaves that are owned by their masters at the time, those slaveholders should not be paid, should not be compensated for their loss of their property. Remember, slaves were property. So that's what the general theme and message was of The Liberator at the time, and the basic general view of William Lloyd Garrison. He created an organization known as the American Anti-Slavery Society. It was funded by both Garrison and another abolitionist he worked with, Theodore Weld. And basically, similar to what David Walker was talking about in 1831, helped show the country the violence of slavery. Right? And we also had other notable people like Harriet Tubman working the Underground Railroad. I'll have a map up here in a second where you can look at the Underground Railroad to see exactly where in the United States that was. And she was able to save 1,000 slaves in 1 year, given the Underground Railroad. So here's a piece of artwork that depicts Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Notice how it's more pro-white than it is pro-slave. And this is William Lloyd Garrison, the founder and publisher of The Liberator. He was the guy, he was the dude when it came to abolitionists during this time period. All right, so the video that I'd like you to watch now, again, go back to the link in Schoology. You can stop me here. This is a good overview of Nat Turner's rebellion. Might be, again, a little more in-depth than what's needed, but it's really good. And he does a great job of explaining. It's from U.S. History Review, and he does a really good job of explaining why the rebellion took place and the significance of it. Okay, so you can stop me now, and I'll be here when you get back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. You're looking at here a map of the Underground Railroad. Remember, Harriet Tubman was one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. And you can see the most of the Underground Railroad helped runaway slaves. You probably learned this about this in middle school and whatnot. Leave the South, find refuge either in Canada or other towns, perhaps in the North. Very rarely did you have slave catchers, which was completely legal at the time, go into the northern states. Certainly not as far north as Canada, but they were allowed to retrieve their slaves. The map shows, you can see here, the free and slave areas determined by their state constitution. So largely purple, slave in the south, largely orangish red there, free in the north. And you can see the arrows there, the Underground Railroad system, and the stations that were created. Okay, most fugitives fled either from Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Those are the states that bordered the free states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, Illinois. But there were some slaves that escaped from the lower South. And what they did is, for example, from Alabama and Mississippi and whatnot, they would have to get on the river, probably the Mississippi River, and make their way to the north. All right, but that was the Underground Railroad. Now, I mentioned earlier that not every Northerner was pro-abolition. Not every Northerner was an abolitionist. And you might be thinking, why in the world would you be perhaps against abolition? It would sound like you would be against civil rights. You would be against human rights, right? It sounds immoral. Well, abolitionists, first of all, in the general population, were very few in number. And there were people in the North that benefited actually from slavery. We've talked about this. We've talked about the market revolution. We talked about the Industrial Revolution that began around 1800, the late 1790s and the early 1800s. And I've even mentioned in previous lectures that cotton, for example, as a natural resource, was shipped to the North, right, to be used by northern factories and turned into clothing and then shipped back to the South. Well, the people who are running those industries, right, the capitalists, the employers, they're the ones who are benefiting from slavery, because if it wasn't for slavery, that natural resource of cotton would not be getting to those factories in the North. So textile manufacturers, hog farmers were also benefiting from slavery because cotton wasn't the only thing that was being produced in the South. So there were a number of natural resources and materials and foodstuffs and whatnot that were being shipped north that northern employers and hog farmers, for example, were benefiting from. Also, many whites opposed the intermarriage of whites and blacks. So this means that if you tended to be more pro-abolition, that encouraged the ideas, right? It must mean that you're also in favor of the intermarried, people, whites and blacks being married or having some sort of relationship. And it was very, very much looked down upon, right, for whites and blacks to have any kind of relationship at all, let alone getting married. One of the most outspoken abolitionists and the editor of his own newspaper was Elijah Lovejoy, who was murdered in Illinois. And even the U.S. House of Representatives, I don't want to say was against abolition. However, they did impose what was called a gag rule during this time, where any and all anti-slavery petitions that came before the House or bills that came before the House would not be discussed. They would just be tabled. And eventually this would be overturned by John Quincy Adams. There you see a picture of what happened to Elijah Lovejoy. They stormed his home. You can see the ladder being put up, and then what they did is they shot Elijah Lovejoy, anti-abolitionists did, as he was trying to escape from his home. And there is John Quincy Adams. Remember John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States. We just talked about him, the election of 1824. Remember, corrupt bargain? He was the man who later overturned the gag rule, but it's hard to believe that in the United States House of Representatives they refused to take up any anti-slavery bills in Congress during this time. And the abolitionist movement would kind of spill over into the women's rights movement of the day, and the abolitionist movement would be split. They'd be very divided when it came to women's rights. William Lloyd Garrison, if you recall, created or founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. They tended to support women's rights and the women's rights movement. But the other half of the abolitionist movement really didn't see a need or feel a need, or believe, for that matter, that women should play really a role either in the abolitionist movement or really have many rights at all, other than what were viewed to be her rights within the home, so more domestic. So that kind of brings us then right into the women's rights movement, okay? And with the women's rights movement, women, remember, would play both a major role and would be inspired by the Second Great Awakening, and they would also play a major role in religion, and therefore they play a major role in trying to reform American society. And we start seeing kind of a blend, a mix of reform and religion taking shape in some of these social movements, whether they be abolition, right? Religion would play a role in abolition, the abolitionist movement, and it would also play a role here with the women's rights movement and the role women would play in reforming many parts of society. And a couple of people that have to be mentioned here. One is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was quite a woman. She helped reform the mental health industry in this country. Before she came along and suggested that people who were suffering from mental health issues were human beings. Before that, people were just basically in charge of taking people with mental health issues, taking care of them at home or in some other place, and they would be paid for or compensated by the state. And what a lot of people did is they would just collect the money and then not care for the person. Well, when Dorothea Dix saw this and got wind of this, she suggested that there needed to be some sort of reform that takes place. So new facilities, and she advocated for the poor and the mentally ill. She was the first to create the country's first mental health asylum, and it might be far from ideal by 21st century standards, but compared to the way these people were being cared for before her suggestions, this was indeed an improvement. So the other person that needs to be mentioned here too, social reform, was Horace Mann. So he's a great guy, right? I'm a little biased, but he was known as the father of education. And he supported tax-supported elementary schools. And back then, the minimum requirement and really the maximum level of education for a lot of people was elementary school. So he was at least supporting public tax-funded elementary schools, at least. And this started to take place in the North largely because remember the Northern economy was much more diverse. So the tax base, meaning the people who could pay the tax, there were more people who could do that to help support elementary schools in the North than there were in the South or the West. Therefore, the schools we see in the South and the West were very far and few between. They are much more, much inferior to those schools that we find in the North. Right? And when we talk about black and women rights, we talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, a woman, an African-American woman, writing her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, if memory serves, I believe was the best-selling or the second best-selling novel of the 19th century behind the Bible. Okay, and in that book she portrayed the evils of slavery. It was published in 1852, and by today's standards it was a New York Times bestseller, a million times over. And this was published, like I said, only about 8-10 years prior to the Civil War. So this would have a huge influence on the states. He would have a huge influence on eventually the Civil War, right? Two other notables, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, would organize and lead what was known as the Seneca Falls Convention. And this was a convention that met in Seneca Falls, New York. And I won't talk a lot about it because if you click on the link here where it says click for video, you can watch the last video clip of the slides. And it's a good little 6-minute PBS video about the Seneca Falls Convention. And what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott did is they drafted a Declaration of Sentiments. And it was patterned very much like the Declaration of Independence, where they stated that all men and women are created equal. So I encourage you to watch the video, know a little bit about the Seneca Falls Convention. And like I said, that's the very next slide. Okay, here in the upper right, we have Dorothea Dix, and this is Horace Mann, the father of public education. One of the cartoons that we might be working with a short answer question was this cartoon known as Temperance Broadside, which shows the connection between the women's rights movement and the temperance movement, the banning and getting rid of alcohol, or at least that's what the proposal was. So we'll be looking at this one a little bit more. All right, so here's we do a quick review. We talked about all those things, and remember all of those things again are happening simultaneously. There are some divisions within them, right? We looked at the transcendentalists, the emphasis on the individual, but we also took a look at not just reforming the individual, but the evangelical look at how it was important for the individual to reform society now. We took a look at the utopian communities, the Shakers, the Oneidas, more of in the rural setting, right? But we also took a look at what was going on in the urban life with minstrel shows and nativism. And then one of the big social movements of the day, reform movements, of course, was the anti-slavery movement or the abolition movement. Names to remember: Nat Turner, William Lloyd Garrison. I throw in David Walker there. And how abolitionists start to spill over with women's rights. Keep in mind, remember, that not every Northerner was pro-abolition, and not every abolitionist was in favor of women's rights. So key women there: Dorothea Dix, right? She reformed the mental health industry. And then, of course, you have Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott leading the Seneca Falls Convention. Okay? So that's all that I have, guys. Great job. Thanks for hanging in there. And we'll be moving on then to Chapter 12 soon. Bye for now.